The grand ballroom of Alexander Volkov's hillside mansion sparkled under crystal chandeliers, as waiters in crisp black suits weaved through clusters of well-dressed guests. The charity gala was in full swing, with the elite of both the music and sports worlds mingling over champagne and soft classical music playing from hidden speakers. Alexander Volkov stood near his prized Steinway grand piano, a glass of water in hand as he nodded politely at whatever the older gentleman in a bow tie was saying. At 62, Volkov maintained the straight-backed posture of someone who had spent decades at the piano bench. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his piercing blue eyes constantly scanned the room as if assessing every conversation, every laugh, every clink of glasses. "Excuse me," Volkov said suddenly, cutting off the man mid-sentence as his attention fixed on something across the room. "There's someone I must greet." He moved with purpose through the crowd, his tailored suit barely brushing against the guests he passed. Volkov wasn't known for social warmth. His reputation was built on musical genius and uncompromising, standards that had made him both celebrated and feared in classical music circles. What had caught his eye was the unmistakable figure of Ronda Rousey, standing somewhat awkwardly near a table of hors d'oeuvres. The UFC champion looked striking but out of place in a simple black dress, her athletic build and watchful stance setting her apart from the socialites around her. "Ms. Rousey," Volkov said, extending his hand, "I'm honored you accepted my foundation's invitation." Ronda shook his hand firmly. "Thanks for having me. I'll admit, classical music fundraisers aren't usually my scene, and fighters are not typically on my guest list," Volkov replied with the hint of a smile. "But exceptions must be made for exceptional people." A waiter passed with a tray of drinks and Ronda took a glass of sparkling water. "I watched your last fight," Volkov continued, surprising her. "The discipline in your movements, it was like watching a carefully composed piece of music." Ronda raised an eyebrow. "Most people just see the violence. Most people lack vision," Volkov dismissed with a wave of his hand. "I see the years of practice behind each move. The timing, the rhythm, the control, not so different from what I do. Except nobody tries to break your arm while you play Chopin," Ronda said with a small laugh. "You'd be surprised how cutthroat the classical music world can be," Volkov responded, his eyes crinkling slightly, "though our battles are fought with different weapons." As they spoke, a young woman approached them, clearly nervous to interrupt. "Mr. Volkov, I'm so sorry, but the director of the children's music program would like a word about tonight's donation announcement." Volkov nodded. "Ms. Rousey, would you care to continue our conversation somewhere quieter? The noise in here is becoming tiresome, and I find myself curious about your journey." Ronda glanced around the ballroom, where several people were not so subtly watching her, probably wondering what the famous fighter was doing at such an event. "Sure, why not?" she agreed. Volkov led her through a doorway and down a hallway lined with framed photographs. Volkov with orchestras around the world, with famous composers, receiving awards on grand stages. They passed several closed doors before he stopped at one, producing a small key from his pocket. "My private sanctuary," he explained as he unlocked the door, "where I do my real work." The room that opened before them took Ronda's breath away. It was large and circular, with a domed ceiling painted with clouds and soft golden light. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the twinkling city lights below, and the walls were lined with acoustic panels disguised as elegant wood paneling. In the center sat not one but 3 grand pianos, each glossy, black, and intimidating. "Wow," Ronda said simply. "This is intense." "This room is designed for perfect sound," Volkov explained, his voice taking on a warmer tone as he walked to the center of the space. Every angle, every surface, every material was chosen for acoustic perfection. Ronda walked slowly around the perimeter, noticing smaller details, the antique metronome on a side table, the neatly arranged sheet music, the absence of any personal photos or mementos. "This was purely a space for music. So this is where the magic happens," she said. "Magic?" Volkov shook his head. "No, discipline, practice, precision, yes. I don't believe in magic, Ms. Rousey." "Call me Ronda," she said, running her finger lightly along the edge of one piano, and I meant it as a figure of speech. Volkov sat at the bench of the center piano, his hands resting lightly on his knees. "Tell me, Ronda, how many hours do you train each day?" "Depends on where I am in my fight cycle," she answered. but usually between 4 and 6 hours of physical training, plus film study, recovery work, and mental preparation. And how many years have you been fighting? Since I was a kid, really. Started with judo when I was 11, so over 20 years now. Volkov nodded thoughtfully. I began playing at 4, 8 hours minimum every day since I was 10. That's 52 years of daily practice. He ran his fingers over the keys without pressing them, a pianist's habit. The human brain is fascinating, isn't it? He continued. The neural pathways we create through repetition. Your body knows exactly how to execute an armbar without conscious thought. My fingers find Rachmaninoff's patterns without looking. Ronda leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. Is this where you tell me that fighting isn't really art and music is superior? Volkov laughed, a surprisingly warm sound in the perfect acoustics of the room. Not at all. Quite the opposite. I believe they come from the same place, the pursuit of physical perfection as a form of expression. He finally pressed a key, a single note that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. The difference is that most people understand what you do. They see the result, victory, defeat. Clear outcomes, another note lower this time. What I do remains mysterious to many. They feel something when they hear music, but they don't understand why or how it happens. Ronda watched him curiously. There was something compelling about the intensity with which he spoke, reminding her of certain coaches she'd had, the ones who saw fighting as something more than just violence or sport. I've spent my life trying to bridge that gap, Volkov continued. To make people understand that music isn't magic, it's mathematics, physics, and human emotion, translated through years of technical mastery. He turned on the bench to face her fully. Which brings me to a theory I've developed over the years. Ronda, I believe that true mastery in one discipline can translate to another, given the right guidance. Like how some dancers make good fighters because of their balance and body awareness, Ronda asked. Exactly, Volkov nodded, seeming pleased. The underlying principles of excellence are universal. He patted the bench beside him. Come, sit. Ronda hesitated but then walked over and sat at the edge of the bench. Put your hands on the keys, Volkov instructed. I don't play, she said, keeping her hands in her lap. Never even had lessons as a kid. Humor an old man, Volkov said with unexpected gentleness. Just place your hands. Reluctantly, Ronda put her hands on the white keys, her fingers looking strange and out of place to her, hands more accustomed to making fists than creating music. Your hands are strong, Volkov observed, but they're also precise. I've seen what they can do in the octagon. Without warning, he placed his hands over hers and pressed down, creating a simple chord that resonated through the room. Ronda felt a strange tingle up her arms. Feel that? Volkov asked. That's power under control. Just like a perfectly executed throw. He removed his hands and stood up, pacing slowly behind her. I have a proposition for you, Ronda Rousey, he said, his voice taking on a formal tone again, one that may seem odd, but I ask you to consider it seriously. Ronda turned on the bench to look at him, eyebrows raised in question. Learn to play, he said simply. Let me teach you. She laughed, thinking he was joking, but his expression remained serious. You can't be serious, she said. I'm training for a fight. I don't have time to take up piano. 3 months, Volkov pressed. 3 hours twice a week. That's all I ask. But why? Ronda stood up, genuinely confused. What could you possibly get out of teaching me? I'm sure you have talented students lining up around the block. Volkov walked to the window, looking out at the night sky. I have no shortage of technically proficient students. What I lack are individuals who truly understand discipline, who have pushed their bodies and minds to their absolute limits. He turned back to her. You see, I have a theory that someone like you, with your level of physical mastery and mental focus, could achieve in months what takes others years. So I'm some kind of experiment? Ronda crossed her arms again. Call it research if you prefer. Volkov smiled slightly. Or a challenge. I suspect you don't back down from those easily. Ronda narrowed her eyes. This strange, intense man had somehow found exactly the right button to push. Throughout her career, people had told her what she couldn't do. Couldn't be a successful female fighter. Couldn't cross over to different fighting styles. Couldn't make it in movies or other ventures. What exactly would this involve? She asked cautiously. You come here, to this room. Volkov gestured around them. I teach you. No audience, no pressure. Just the pursuit of something new. He walked back to the piano, closing the fallboard over the keys with a gentle click. "Think about it," he said. "You can let me know your decision before you leave tonight." Before Ronda could respond, the door to the piano room opened and the same nervous assistant from earlier appeared. "Mr. Volkov, they're ready for your speech and the presentation of the donation check," she said. "Duty calls," Volkov sighed. He turned to Ronda and extended his hand. "Shall we return to the party, Ms. Rousey?" As they walked back toward the ballroom, Ronda found herself glancing back at the piano room door as it closed behind them. Something about the space had felt unusual, almost alive in a way she couldn't explain. And despite the absurdity of the proposition, she was surprised to find herself actually considering it. After all, how hard could playing the piano really be for someone who had mastered Olympic judo and dominated the UFC? It might even make for good cross-training, improving her hand coordination and focus. "Challenge accepted," she said suddenly, stopping in the hallway. Volkov turned, a look of genuine surprise crossing his face before he composed himself. "Excellent," he said, the hint of a real smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We begin on Monday, 9 a.m. sharp." As they rejoined the gala, Ronda wondered what exactly she had gotten herself into. She had no idea that her decision would lead to discoveries far stranger than learning to play a musical instrument, or that the piano room itself would soon reveal secrets that neither she nor Volkov were prepared for. Monday morning arrived. With a light drizzle that left the air misty and cool, Ronda pulled her car into the circular driveway of Volkov's mansion, checking her watch. 8:52 a.m. She was early, but something told her that 9 sharp to Alexander Volkov meant 8:55 at the latest. She grabbed her gym bag, packed with water, a small towel and workout clothes for her training session later, and made her way to the front door. Before she could ring the bell, the door swung open to reveal a thin man with round glasses who introduced himself as Gregory, Volkov's house manager. "Mr. Volkov is waiting for you in the piano room," Gregory said, his voice carrying a slight Eastern European accent. "May I take your jacket?" As Ronda handed over her rain jacket, she noticed how quiet the massive house was. None of the party buzz from the other. Night remained, just an almost eerie stillness, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the foyer. Gregory led her down the now familiar hallway lined with Volkov's achievements. In daylight, Ronda noticed details she'd missed before: the slight yellowing of older photographs, the evolution of Volkov from a stern-faced young man to the silver-haired maestro she'd met. In all the photos, spanning what must have been decades, his posture and serious expression remained unchanged. When they reached the piano room door, Gregory knocked softly before opening it. "Ms. Rousey has arrived, sir," he announced, then stepped aside to let Ronda enter. The room looked different in daylight. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floor. Volkov sat at one of the pianos, his back straight as a ruler, jotting notes on sheet music. Without looking up, he gestured to a small table where a steaming cup waited. "Green tea," he said. "I read in an interview that you prefer it before training." "I consider this training." Ronda approached the table. "Thanks. That was thoughtful." Volkov finally looked up, setting his pencil down precisely parallel to the edge of the sheet music. "I believe in creating the right conditions for learning. Comfort, but not too much comfort." He stood and walked to the center piano, the one she'd briefly sat at during the gala. "We'll begin with posture, the foundation of everything." For the next 20 minutes, Ronda endured what felt like the world's most specific posture adjustment session. Volkov circled her like a hawk, tapping her shoulders to lower them, straightening her spine, adjusting the angle of her wrists as they hovered over the keys. "Your fighting stance has affected your natural posture," he observed. "You carry tension in your shoulders and keep your weight slightly forward, ready to move. For piano, we need something different, grounded but loose." "I've spent 20 years developing that posture," Ronda said, trying not to sound defensive. "And now you'll learn another," Volkov replied simply. "The body can hold multiple memories." When he was finally satisfied with how she sat, he began explaining the basics, the names of the keys, the structure of octaves, the proper finger positions. It was surprisingly technical, more like learning a fighting system than the creative process Ronda had imagined. "Place your thumbs on middle C," Volkov instructed, demonstrating on a second piano. "Now we'll play a simple 5-note scale using one finger for each note." Ronda followed his example, pressing down carefully. The notes that emerged sounded hesitant and uneven compared to the fluid sound Volkov produced. "Harder," he said. "You're being too gentle." "The keys need firm pressure." She pressed harder. And the notes rang out more clearly. "Better." Again, they repeated the simple exercise over and over until Ronda's fingers began to ache in a strange way, not like the familiar pain of throwing punches or gripping an opponent, but a new kind of strain in muscles she rarely used with such precision. After an hour of these basic exercises, Volkov checked his watch. "We'll take a 5-minute break. Stand up, stretch your hands." Ronda stood gratefully, rolling her shoulders and flexing her fingers. "This is harder than I expected," she admitted. "Most worthwhile things are," Volkov replied, walking to the window. "The body must be reconditioned for any new skill. Your hands are strong but trained for different movements." As Ronda stretched, she noticed something odd about the room. Despite the large windows, there was no sound from outside, no birds, no distant traffic, nothing. The space felt completely isolated from the world, almost like a recording studio. "This room has perfect acoustics," she observed. Volkov nodded. "It took 3 years to build. Every surface, every angle, every material was chosen for its acoustic properties. It feels, I don't know, alive somehow," Ronda said, immediately feeling foolish for saying it out loud. Volkov turned to her sharply. "What do you mean by that?" Ronda shrugged. "Just that it has a presence. Maybe it's the acoustics or something." For a moment, Volkov stared at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Then his expression softened. "You're more perceptive than most," he said quietly. "Let's continue." The remainder of the lesson focused on learning to read basic notation. By the end of the 3 hours, Ronda could haltingly play a simple melody with her right hand. "Mary had a little lamb," which made her feel like a child, though she didn't complain. "Not terrible for a first lesson," Volkov said, which Ronda suspected was high praise coming from him. "You have assignments before Wednesday." He handed her a thin booklet of beginner piano, exercises and a rolled-up paper keyboard, a practice tool that showed the keys but made no sound. 1 hour of practice each day, finger positions and the first 3 exercises. The silent keyboard will help you practice without a piano. As Ronda was gathering her things, something strange happened. A sheet of music on a side table suddenly fluttered to the floor, though there was no breeze in the sealed room. Volkov moved quickly to pick it up, his face tightening. "Did you feel a draft?" Ronda asked. "Old houses settle," Volkov said dismissively, carefully replacing the sheet music. "Wednesday 9 a.m., don't be late." Over the next 2 weeks, Ronda fell into a new routine. Morning training, afternoon meetings or PR obligations, evening piano practice on the silent keyboard in her living room. The piano lessons with Volkov continued twice weekly, and to her surprise, she found herself looking forward to them. There was something calming about the focused concentration required, so different from the physical intensity of fighting. Her progress was slow but steady, from simple melodies to using both hands together, from basic finger exercises to more complex patterns. And with each lesson, she became more convinced that there was something unusual about Volkov's piano room. It wasn't anything she could easily explain. Sometimes the temperature would change suddenly, dropping several degrees when she hit a wrong note, warming when she played something correctly. Once she was certain she heard a faint echo of notes she'd played moments before, though Volkov claimed not to hear anything. Most strange was how the room's acoustics seemed to adjust to her playing. When she struggled, the sound became muted, almost absorbed by the walls. But when she played well, the notes rang out with a richness that seemed impossible from her beginner's hands. During her 4th lesson, while Volkov stepped out briefly to take a phone call, Ronda decided to experiment. She played a simple C major scale, the first thing he taught her, as perfectly as she could. The notes hung in the air with beautiful clarity. Then she deliberately played the same scale with wrong notes. Immediately, the acoustics seemed to deaden, and she felt a distinct cold spot form near her right shoulder. "What are you doing in here?" she whispered, feeling both silly and genuinely curious. The sheet music on the piano stand flipped to the next page. Ronda jerked her hands away from the keys, heart pounding. She stood up from the bench just as Volkov returned. "Is something wrong?" he asked, noticing her expression. "The music. It turned by itself," she said, pointing at the sheet music. Volkov glanced at it, then back at her. Did you perhaps bump the stand? No, I was just sitting here and... She trailed off, realizing how it sounded. The mind plays tricks when we're learning something new, Volkov said, his tone patronizing. The brain creates connections, sometimes imagines things to make sense of unfamiliar patterns. He sat back down at his piano. Let's continue with the Bach. But as the lesson progressed, Ronda caught Volkov watching her with an odd expression when he thought she wasn't looking. And twice more she felt cold spots move around the room, following her mistakes. After the lesson ended, Ronda decided to ask the question that had been building for weeks. Mr. Volkov, what's really going on with this room? He busied himself arranging sheet music. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Ronda pressed. The temperature changes, the way the acoustics shift, things moving without being touched. This isn't normal. Volkov sighed and sat down on his piano bench, suddenly looking older. You're imagining things, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Perhaps we should end our experiment. If you're becoming uncomfortable, I'm not quitting, Ronda said firmly, but I want to know what I'm part of. I've spent my life trusting my instincts, and right now they're telling me there's more to this room than you're saying. For a long moment, Volkov studied her, his blue eyes calculating. Finally, he nodded almost imperceptibly. Continue your practice. If you still want answers after our next lesson, perhaps you'll get them. As Ronda drove home, her mind replayed every strange occurrence in the piano room. She was certain Volkov was hiding something. The question was, what could possibly make a room respond to music in such an unusual way? She found herself practicing longer than usual that night. Her fighter's determination now focused on solving this mystery. Whatever was happening in that piano room, she was going to find out. And something told her it went far beyond acoustics and architecture. For the next 3 days, Ronda couldn't stop thinking about the piano room. She found herself practicing more diligently than ever, not just to improve her playing, but because she sensed that somehow her progress was connected to the room's strange behavior. Her training partners noticed her distraction during sparring sessions. After she missed an obvious counter during practice, her head coach Tom pulled her aside. Your body's here, but your mind isn't, he said, concern evident in his voice. What's going on? The fight's only 8 weeks away. Ronda took a long drink from her water bottle, buying time. How could she explain that she was preoccupied with a possibly haunted piano room? Just trying something new for mental focus, she said finally. Piano lessons. Tom's eyebrows shot up. Piano? Like music piano? Yeah, it's about precision and control. Different kind of discipline. The explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. Uh-huh, Tom said skeptically. Well, whatever you're doing, get your head straight. Garcia's no joke. She'll take your belt if you're thinking about Mozart during the fight. Ronda nodded, guilt washing over her. Maybe this whole piano experiment had been a mistake. Her career, her title defense, those were what mattered, not some weird acoustics and an eccentric old pianist. But Wednesday morning still found her pulling up to Volkov's mansion at 8:55, a strange mix of anticipation and apprehension swirling in her stomach. Gregory met her at the door as usual. But today his typically impassive face showed signs of tension. Mr. Volkov is already in the piano room, he said, his voice lower than usual. He's been there since dawn. As Ronda walked down the hallway, she could hear music drifting from behind the closed door. Not the precise, controlled classical pieces Volkov usually played, but something wild and stormy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She knocked, but there was no answer. The music continued, growing more frantic. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the door. Volkov sat at the center piano, his body swaying as his hands flew across the keys. The music he played seemed to fill every corner of the room, building to a crescendo that was almost painful in its intensity. He didn't look up or acknowledge her presence, but the room was responding. The morning sunlight through the windows pulsed in time with the music. The air itself seemed to vibrate, creating visible ripples like heat waves rising from hot pavement, and most disturbing of all, a fine dust or mist collected near the ceiling, swirling into patterns that formed and dissolved with each change in the music. Ronda stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to interrupt, but equally afraid to watch what was happening. Finally, as Volkov struck a thunderous chord and held it, letting it echo throughout the space, she cleared her throat loudly. The sound broke whatever spell had gripped the room. The mist dissipated, The light steadied, and Volkov's hands lifted slowly from the keys. He turned to look at her, and Ronda was shocked by his appearance. His face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes. "You're early," he said, his voice hoarse. Ronda checked her watch. "It's 9 exactly." Volkov glanced at the ornate clock on the wall, seeming surprised. "So it is." He stood up stiffly from the bench. "Let's begin, then. What was that?" Ronda asked, not moving from the doorway. "What I just saw?" "A warm-up exercise," Volkov said dismissively. "Nothing more." "No." Ronda shook her head firmly. "No more brush-offs." "The room was doing things. Responding to your playing. I saw it." For a long moment, Volkov stood silently, his internal struggle visible on his face. Then his shoulders slumped slightly. "Close the door," he said quietly. Ronda stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind her. As it clicked shut, she had the distinct feeling of being sealed inside something alive. Volkov walked to a side table and poured water from a crystal decanter into 2 glasses. He handed one to Ronda, then gestured to a small seating area by the windows, 2 leather armchairs she hadn't noticed before. "Sit," he said. "This may take some time to explain." Ronda sat, noticing that despite the morning sun streaming through the windows, the leather was cool to the touch. Volkov settled into the opposite chair with a heavy sigh. "What do you know about acoustics?" he asked. "Not much," Ronda admitted. "Just that this room has perfect acoustics, according to you." "Perfect is an understatement," Volkov said, staring into his water glass. "This room is unique, one of a kind." He took a small sip before continuing. "It was designed by my wife, Elena. She was a brilliant acoustic engineer, the best in her field. This room was her masterpiece, her obsession for the last 5 years of her life." "What makes it so special?" Ronda asked. "The materials, for one thing," Volkov gestured around them. "The walls contain a special composite Elena developed, microscopic resonators embedded in layers of treated wood. The ceiling is shaped to create what she called harmonic feedback loops. Even the glass in the windows is custom-made to certain specifications." He set his glass down on a small table. "But the truly revolutionary aspect was the computational element." "Computational?" Ronda repeated, confused. "Like computers?" "Not exactly." Elena theorized that acoustic spaces could develop a kind of memory, that the vibrations of sound waves, if properly contained and channeled, could create patterns that the room would learn to recognize and respond to. Ronda thought about the strange occurrences she'd witnessed. "So the room remembers music that's been played in it?" "It does more than remember," Volkov said, his voice dropping lower. "It anticipates, it participates." He stood suddenly and walked to the center piano, running his hand along its polished surface with unexpected tenderness. Elena never saw it completed. She died of an aneurysm 3 months before construction finished. I've spent the 7 years since then playing in this room, feeding it music, teaching it to respond. "Teaching it," Ronda repeated. "Perhaps awakening it would be more accurate," Volkov corrected himself. The potential was always there in Elena's design. It just needed time and consistent input to fully develop. Ronda took a long drink of water, trying to process what she was hearing. It sounded impossible, yet she'd seen evidence with her own eyes. "So when the temperature changes or the acoustics shift when I play, the room is responding to you," Volkov confirmed. "To your music. To your emotional state while playing. It's what Elena intended. A space that amplifies not just sound but feeling." "That's..." Ronda searched for the right word. "That's incredible. But also kind of creepy." A ghost of a smile touched Volkov's lips. "Elena would have appreciated your honesty. She never had patience for people who couldn't acknowledge both the wonder and the strangeness of her work." He returned to his chair, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees. "For years I've been the only one who could truly activate the room's full potential. Until you." "Me?" Ronda said in disbelief. "But I can barely play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star without messing up." "It's not about technical skill," Volkov said, shaking his head. "It's about connection. Emotional resonance. Most of my advanced students play with perfect technique but feel nothing. They produce sound but not music." His intense blue eyes fixed on her. "You play imperfectly but with genuine feeling. The room responds to that." Ronda remembered the sheet music turning itself, the cold spots that followed her mistakes. "So when weird things happen while I'm playing..." The room is communicating, Volkov said. Responding to your music, trying to guide you. Guide me to what? Volkov hesitated. I'm not entirely sure. That's what makes this so fascinating. In all my years playing here, I've never seen the room respond to a beginner the way it responds to you. He stood again, too restless to remain seated. That's why I wanted you to learn. Why I approached you at the gala. I've watched your fights. The way you lose yourself in the moment, your complete emotional commitment. I suspected you might be able to connect with the room in a way others couldn't. So I really am an experiment, Ronda said, a hint of anger coloring her voice. A collaboration, Volkov corrected. Between you, me, and Elena's creation. Ronda stood too, crossing her arms. You should have told me from the beginning. Would you have believed me? Volkov challenged. Or would you have walked away thinking I was a delusional old man? He had a point, and Ronda knew it. She uncrossed her arms and walked slowly around the room, seeing it with new eyes, not just as an acoustic space but as something semi-alive. Aware in some fundamental way she didn't fully understand. What happens now? She asked finally. We continue, Volkov said simply, but with a new goal. Not just teaching you to play, but exploring what the room can do when you play. He walked to the center piano and lifted the fallboard. Let's find out what happens when you play with full awareness of the room's capabilities. Now? Ronda asked, suddenly nervous. What should I play? The Bach prelude we've been working on, Volkov said. But this time, don't focus on playing it perfectly. Focus on how it makes you feel. Ronda sat at the piano, placing her hands in the now familiar starting position. She took a deep breath and began to play, the simple, flowing notes of the Bach prelude filling the room. At first, nothing seemed different. Then, as she reached a passage she particularly liked, Ronda felt a warm current of air brush her cheek. The acoustics of the room shifted subtly, enriching the tone of the notes. A pleasant tingling sensation traveled up her arms from the keys. Don't stop, Volkov said quietly. The room is responding to your enjoyment of that passage. Ronda continued playing, now acutely aware of the room's reactions. When she fumbled a difficult section, the temperature cooled noticeably. When she recovered and played a beautiful phrase, the sunlight through the windows brightened. And then something truly remarkable happened. As she played the final measures, a faint echo began to accompany her. Not an acoustic reflection of her notes, but complementary notes that she wasn't playing. A subtle harmony that made her simple performance sound richer and more complex. The last note hung in the air longer than should have been possible, vibrating with a strange intensity before finally fading. Ronda turned to Volkov, her eyes wide with amazement. Did you hear that? The harmony? Volkov was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before, a mix of excitement and something almost like fear. I heard it, he said. In all my years with this room, it's never done that, never created its own music. He stepped closer to the piano, his voice hushed. Don't you see what this means? The room isn't just responding to you, it's collaborating with you. Ronda looked down at the keys under her fingers, then around at the walls, the ceiling, the windows, all parts of this strange, impossible space that had somehow connected with her playing. I don't understand how this is possible, she said. Neither do I, Volkov admitted. Neither did Elena, not fully. She created something that exceeded even her understanding. He sat beside her on the bench, but we have an opportunity now to explore it together, if you're willing. Ronda thought about her upcoming fight, her training schedule, all the practical reasons to walk away from this strange situation. But she also thought about the extraordinary feeling when the room had added its own notes to her playing, a connection unlike anything she'd experienced before. I'm willing, she said finally, but we do this as equals. No more secrets, Volkov nodded solemnly. No more secrets. As if in response to their agreement, a gentle ripple of sound, like a distant wind chime, echoed through the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The room, it seemed, was pleased. The next few weeks transformed Ronda's life in ways she never expected. Her piano lessons with Volkov expanded from 2 to 4 sessions a week, each lasting longer than scheduled as they explored the room's unusual abilities. Her fight training continued, but she found herself rushing through sessions, her mind already in Volkov's piano room. Tom and her other coaches noticed the change but attributed it to pre-fight nerves. Only her close friend and training partner Lucia seemed truly concerned. You're somewhere else these days, Lucia said, after a particularly distracted sparring session. Is everything okay? Ronda tightened the wraps on her hands, avoiding Lucia's eyes. Just working through some stuff. I'm fine. Is it the piano thing? Tom mentioned it seems unlike you. Ronda laughed softly. Yeah, I guess it does. She considered telling Lucia about the room, about the incredible things she'd experienced there. But how could she explain it without sounding crazy? Even she still struggled to believe it sometimes. It's just something different, she said finally. Something that's just for me, not for fighting or fans or sponsors. Know what I mean? Lucia nodded slowly. I get it. But your fight's in 5 weeks. Garcia's been training like a beast. I know. I'm ready. The words came automatically, but Ronda felt a twinge of doubt. Was she ready? Was her head in the game the way it needed to be? That afternoon, as she drove to Volkov's mansion, those doubts followed her. Maybe this whole piano adventure had been a mistake, a distraction she couldn't afford. Maybe she should tell Volkov they needed to pause until after the fight. But the moment she entered the piano room, those thoughts dissolved. The room seemed to welcome her, the air warming slightly, the light brightening. Over the past weeks, she'd grown increasingly sensitive to these subtle changes. It was like the room was alive, recognizing her presence. Volkov was already there, as always, but today he wasn't alone. A slender woman with silver-streaked dark hair stood examining one of the acoustic panels on the wall. Ah, Ronda, Volkov said, looking up from a stack of sheet music. I'd like you to meet Dr. Natalia Chen. She was Elena's closest colleague and friend. The woman turned, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ms. Rousey, Alexander has told me about your unique connection with the room. Ronda shook the woman's hand, noticing her firm grip and the calculating look in her eyes. Dr. Chen helped Elena develop the theoretical framework for the room's design, Volkov explained. When I told her about what happened last week, she was eager to observe for herself. Last week had marked a significant breakthrough. While playing a Chopin nocturne, Ronda had experienced something extraordinary. The room hadn't just accompanied her playing, but had somehow anticipated it, creating harmonies for notes before she even played them. It was as if the room was reading her intentions, feeling the music along with her. I hope you don't mind an audience today, Volkov said, gesturing to a chair he'd placed in the corner for Dr. Chen. That's fine, Ronda said, though she felt unexpectedly nervous. The room had become a private space, a place where she could be vulnerable in ways she couldn't elsewhere. Having an observer felt intrusive, as if sensing her discomfort. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. Fascinating. The thermal response is much more pronounced than in previous trials. Previous trials? Ronda looked at Volkov questioningly. Natalia has visited before over the years, he explained. She's helped me document the room's evolution. Alexander sent me your playing samples, Dr. Chen said, removing a small device from her bag. The harmonic overlays the room is creating with your music are unlike anything we've recorded previously. I'd like to take some measurements while you play, if that's acceptable. The device in her hand looked like a cross between a smartphone and a scientific instrument, with several small sensors attached. What kind of measurements? Ronda asked, suddenly protective of the room and her connection to it. Just acoustic readings, temperature variations, air pressure changes. Nothing invasive. Dr. Chen's tone was professional but had an underlying eagerness that made Ronda uneasy. Volkov placed a hand on Ronda's shoulder. Perhaps we should begin with your warm-up exercises, then move to the Debussy we've been practicing. Ronda nodded and took her place at the piano. As she began the familiar scale exercises, she found it difficult to concentrate with Dr. Chen moving around the room, placing sensors on various surfaces. The room seemed to share her discomfort. The acoustics were muted, the responsive elements subdued. When she finished her warm-up and moved to the Debussy piece, the usual magic was missing. The notes sounded flat, ordinary. After she finished, Dr. Chen studied her device with a slight frown. The readings are interesting, but not as dramatic as I expected based on Alexander's descriptions. The room is sensitive to changes, Volkov said diplomatically. Perhaps it's adjusting to your presence. Dr. Chen made a note on her device. Or perhaps what you've been experiencing is simply a heightened form of acoustic resonance, not the quasi-conscious response you've described. There was a subtle challenge in her voice that made Rhonda bristle. "It's more than acoustics," she said firmly. "The room doesn't just echo or amplify. It adds things, changes things. It has preferences." Dr. Chen's smile was indulgent. "That's a very human way to interpret physical phenomena, Ms. Rousey. But in science, we must be careful not to anthropomorphize." "Natalia," Volkov cut in, "why don't we take a short break? I believe Gregory has prepared tea in the study." As they left the room, Rhonda remained at the piano, frustrated and disappointed. She'd wanted Dr. Chen to witness what she'd experienced, to validate that it was real and not just her imagination. "I know you're real," she said quietly to the empty room. "I know what we've created together." She placed her hands on the keys and began to play, not the Debussy or anything else Volkov had taught her, but a simple improvisation, following her feelings rather than any sheet music. The melody was melancholy at first, expressing her frustration, then shifted to something more determined. Slowly, the room began to respond. The acoustics opened up, giving her simple notes a richness they hadn't had before. A gentle current of warm air circled her, and the light through the windows took on a golden quality that hadn't been there moments ago. And then, just as had happened the week before, the room began to add its own notes, subtle harmonies that complemented her improvisation, turning her simple melody into something complex and beautiful. Rhonda closed her eyes, letting the music guide her fingers, no longer sure which notes were hers and which came from the room. They were creating something together, something neither could make alone. She was so lost in the experience that she didn't notice the door opening, didn't hear the gasp from Dr. Chen or see the look of vindication on Volkov's face. Only when the piece reached its natural conclusion and the final notes hung in the air did Rhonda open her eyes to find them watching her from the doorway. That Dr. Chen seemed at a loss for words. Her scientific detachment cracked. That was not acoustic resonance. Volkov stepped forward. "Now, do you understand what I've been trying to tell you all these years? The room isn't just responding to input. It's creating, collaborating." Dr. Chen approached the piano slowly, her device forgotten in her hand. Elena always said it was possible theoretically. A space that could learn, that could develop its own patterns based on accumulated input. But I never truly believed. She reached out to touch the piano, then pulled her hand back. "May I, would it allow me?" The question wasn't directed at Volkov or Rhonda, but at the room itself. Rhonda felt a subtle shift in the air, a kind of acceptance. "I think it's okay. It knows you were Elena's friend." Dr. Chen sat beside Rhonda on the bench and tentatively placed her hands on the keys. She played a few notes of a classical piece Rhonda didn't recognize. The room responded with gentle acoustic enhancement, but nothing like the creative collaboration it had shown with Rhonda. "It's still getting to know you," Rhonda explained, feeling strangely like she was making introductions. "It took weeks before it started adding harmonies for me." Dr. Chen shook her head in wonder. "This is beyond anything we theorized. The room isn't just remembering and reproducing patterns. It's creating new ones. It's learning." Volkov leaned against one of the other pianos, watching them. "The question is, what exactly has it learned? And what is it trying to communicate?" "Communicate?" Dr. Chen looked up sharply. "You think it's trying to send a message?" "I don't know," Volkov admitted. "But lately the harmonies it creates seem to follow a specific pattern, almost like a recurring motif in a larger piece." Rhonda thought about the music they had created together. There was something familiar about the harmonies the room added, something she couldn't quite place. "I've been recording our sessions," Volkov continued, "analyzing the patterns, and I believe the room is trying to reconstruct something, a piece of music it heard long ago." "Elena's music," Dr. Chen whispered. "She used to play here while the room was being built, testing the acoustics as the construction progressed." "Exactly," Volkov nodded. "I believe the room somehow preserved fragments of what she played. And now with Rhonda's help, it's trying to piece those fragments together." Rhonda felt a chill run down her spine. "You think the room is trying to, what, bring back her music?" "Not bring it back," Volkov said softly. "Remember it, share it." Elena's final composition was never written down. She played it only once, the day before she died, when the room was nearly complete. He looked around at the walls, the ceiling, the windows, all designed by his wife's brilliant mind. "I think the room is the only record of that music. and it's been waiting for someone who could help it express what it heard. Dr. Chen stood abruptly and walked to the window, visibly struggling with emotion. This is not what we designed, Alexander. We created an acoustic space, not a memory bank. Perhaps Elena created more than either of you realized, Ronda suggested gently. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, each contemplating the implications of what was happening in this room. Finally, Volkov turned to Ronda. Your fight is in a few weeks. I understand if you need to focus on your training, but after, Ronda nodded, understanding what he was asking. After the fight, we'll find out what the room is trying to tell us. As if in response, a soft ripple of notes, like fingers lightly brushing the highest keys of a piano, whispered through the room. The sound was both beautiful and haunting, a promise and a reminder. Something was waiting to be discovered, a message preserved in music and memory. And somehow Ronda had become the key to unlocking it. Fight night arrived in a blur of lights, noise, and adrenaline. For 3 weeks, Ronda had forced herself to focus exclusively on training. Putting thoughts of the piano room aside, she'd canceled her lessons with Volkov, promising to return after the fight. Her coaches had noticed the change, her renewed intensity, her complete focus, and approved. That's the Rousey we know, Tom had said after her final sparring session. Whatever was distracting you, glad you shook it off. But even as she walked toward the octagon, the crowd roaring around her, Ronda's mind flashed briefly to the piano room. She wondered if it was somehow aware of what she was doing tonight, if it was waiting for her return. The thought vanished as her opponent, Lucia Garcia, entered from the opposite side. Garcia was a dangerous striker with lightning-fast hands and devastating kicks. She'd earned her title shot by knocking out 3 top contenders in the first round. When the referee called them to the center, Ronda looked into Garcia's eyes and saw only determination, hunger. This woman wanted to take everything Ronda had worked for. The bell rang. 5 grueling rounds later, bloodied but unbowed, Ronda had her arm raised in victory. It hadn't been easy. Garcia had caught her with a head kick in the second round that had nearly ended it. But Ronda's grappling expertise had ultimately proved the difference. The submission had come late in the 5th round, a beautifully executed armbar that gave Garcia no choice but to tap. In the post-fight interview, sweaty and exhilarated, Ronda gave the usual answers about her opponent's toughness, her team's excellent preparation, and her plans to keep improving. What she didn't mention was the strange clarity she'd experienced during the fight, moments where time seemed to slow down, where she could sense Garcia's movements before they happened. Almost like when she played piano in Volkov's room, when the music flowed through her and she could feel what notes were coming next. The realization hit her as she was driving home from the arena, still sore but too wired to sleep. The mental state she reached in the piano room and the one she achieved in her best fighting moments were remarkably similar. A flow, state where conscious thought stepped aside and something deeper took control. 2 days later, after media obligations and medical checkups, Ronda drove to Volkov's mansion. It was early evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the driveway. Gregory answered the door with a slight smile, the most emotion she'd ever seen from him. Congratulations on your victory, Ms. Rousey. Mr. Volkov is expecting you in the piano room. As she walked down the hallway, Ronda felt a flutter of anticipation. After weeks away, would the room still respond to her the same way? Had she lost the connection they'd built? She opened the door to find not just Volkov but also Dr. Chen, along with an array of equipment set up around the room, recording devices, sensors, and a large computer workstation in the corner. The champion returns, Volkov said, rising from his seat at one of the pianos. That was quite a fight. Thanks, Ronda said, eyeing the equipment. What's all this? Natalia has been helping me analyze the musical patterns the room has produced during your sessions, Volkov explained. We've been preparing for your return. Dr. Chen stepped forward, looking more animated than Ronda had seen her before. We've isolated recurring motifs in the harmonies the room adds to your playing, fragments that appear consistently across different pieces and sessions. She led Ronda to the computer, where a series of musical notations were displayed alongside waveform analyses. These repeating patterns, Dr. Chen continued, pointing to highlighted sections, they're not random. They have a structure, a coherence that suggests they're parts of a larger composition. Elena's final piece, Volkov said quietly. We think so, Dr. Chen nodded. But we've only captured fragments. We need more. And you think I can help get them? Ronda asked. We know you can, Volkov said. The room responds to you in ways it never has to me or anyone else. With your playing as a foundation, it reveals more of these patterns. Ronda looked at the piano, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. So what's the plan? We've prepared a progression of pieces for you to play, Dr. Chen explained, starting with ones that have already triggered strong responses from the room, then moving to others that might evoke different fragments. Think of it as a conversation, Volkov added. You giving the room opportunities to express what it remembers. Ronda sat at the center piano, stretching her fingers. Despite the weeks away, it felt familiar, comfortable. The room seemed to warm slightly at her presence. I'm ready, she said. For the next 2 hours, Ronda played piece after piece, starting with the Debussy that had first triggered the room's creative response. As before, the room added its own harmonies, subtle at first, then growing more complex. Dr. Chen recorded everything, occasionally adjusting her equipment or making notes. Volkov sat nearby, eyes closed, listening intently. Occasionally, he would nod or gesture for Ronda to repeat a section where the room's response was particularly strong. As the session progressed, Ronda felt herself sinking deeper into that flow state, that place of perfect connection where her playing and the room's responses seemed to merge into a single creative voice. The outside world fell away. No thoughts of fighting, of media obligations, of training schedules. Only the music existed. During a piece by Chopin, something extraordinary happened. As Ronda played the delicate, melancholy melody, the room's response shifted. Instead of simply harmonizing with her playing, it began to introduce an entirely new melody, haunting, complex, and utterly beautiful. Volkov's eyes snapped open. That's it, he whispered. That's Elena's theme. Dr. Chen leaned forward in her chair, her scientific detachment forgotten. It's more complete than anything we've captured before. Ronda continued playing, letting the Chopin piece fade as she tried to follow and support the new melody the room was creating. Her fingers found accompanying chords intuitively, as if the room was guiding her. For several minutes, the three of them were immersed in music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, music that existed at the intersection of memory, technology, and human emotion. When it finally ended, the silence felt heavy, pregnant with meaning. That was... Ronda struggled to find words. That was Elena, Volkov said, his voice thick with emotion. Her final composition, or at least part of it. I recognize elements she'd been working on for years. Dr. Chen was reviewing the recording, her expression one of wonder. The structure is remarkable, complex but coherent. This isn't just fragments anymore. This is substantial enough that we might be able to reconstruct the entire piece. Not reconstruct, Volkov corrected gently. Discover. Elena completed it. She played it here in this room. The room remembered. He turned to Ronda, his typically stern face softened with gratitude. And you helped it express what it remembered. I don't understand why it responded to me this way, Ronda said. I'm not a professional musician. I barely know what I'm doing half the time. Perhaps that's exactly why, Dr. Chen suggested. You play without preconceptions, without technical constraints. You connect emotionally with the music in a direct, unfiltered way. Volkov nodded. Most trained pianists approach the piano with years of technique and theory. You approach it with pure feeling. He walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Elena always said that music theory sometimes gets in the way of musical truth, that we become so focused on how music should be played that we forget how it should be felt. The room seemed to brighten at his words, as if in agreement. So what happens now? Ronda asked. Now we continue, Volkov said, turning back to her. If you're willing. We keep exploring, keep recording. Piece by piece we recover Elena's final composition. And then what? Ronda pressed. What's the end goal here? Volkov and Dr. Chen exchanged a look before Volkov answered. Elena designed this room to be more than just a space for playing music. She believed it could be a new kind of instrument itself, one that learns, adapts, and eventually creates. What we're experiencing may be just the beginning of what's possible. He gestured around the room. Imagine concert halls that don't just amplify music but participate in its creation. Spaces that preserve not just the notes that were played but the emotion behind them. It would revolutionize how we understand music, how we experience it, Dr. Chen added. Elena's vision was always about bridging the gap between the technical and the emotional. Ronda considered this as she ran her fingers lightly over the piano keys. She thought about her fighting career, about the years of technical training that had ultimately led to moments of pure instinct in the octagon. Perhaps music wasn't so different, technique creating the foundation for something more transcendent. "I have another title defense in 6 months," she said finally. "But until then my schedule is pretty open." Volkov smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his austere face. "Then we have work to do." Dr. Chen began adjusting her equipment. "We should try the Bach next." It triggered significant responses in earlier sessions. As they prepared for the next piece, Ronda looked around the room that had become so much more than a piano studio to her. It had become a place of discovery, of connection to something larger than herself. In the octagon, she was known for her power, her aggression, her technical dominance. Here, in this room, she had found something different, a form of expression that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with feeling. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play the Bach piece, feeling the room respond immediately, eagerly, like an old friend continuing a conversation. The music they created together filled the space, not just sound but emotion made audible, memory given voice. It was Elena's gift, preserved in the very walls of the room she had designed. And now, through an unlikely partnership between a classical pianist, a UFC champion, and a room unlike any other in the world, that gift would finally be shared. As the final notes of the evening session faded away, Ronda knew that while fighting would always be her profession, she had found in music something equally valuable, another path to that perfect state of flow, that place where technique and emotion became one, and boundaries between the physical and the spiritual dissolved. The famous pianist had indeed compelled her to play, but the piano room had given her something in return, a new way to express the strength that had always defined her, not through power but through something gentler yet no less profound. And that, perhaps, was the most surprising victory of all.